As most of you know, I'm working on the circuit of annual swimming matches in Devon and Cornwall in the late Victorian and Edwardian era. And this presentation has arisen out of my research into the formation of the sites of the swimming matches and local bathing practices associated with them. So this is St Ives, which is the place I'm going to be talking about. The town grew up around the harbour. It's in the middle. The beach here, Porthminster, which faces the Atlantic, sorry I've lost that now, was still regarded as a very wild and desolate place in the 19th century, whilst the sheltered natural amphitheatre here of Porthminster, by contrast, was the site of the town's seine fishing industry. And as you can see, before and after, when the railway came in there, the natural topography of the place meant that the railway came in and had to stop on that beach. The seine fishery, this shows how that was carried out. It was the mainstay of the St Ives fishing industry. It was highly seasonal, took place between August and late September, when vast migrating shoals of pilchards, sometimes 2 or 3 miles long, the shoals, not the pilchards, and containing tens of millions of individual fish, would arrive no more than a few hundred yards off Porthminster beach. Boat crews would compete against each other to row around, to encircle and enclose as much of the shoal as possible in long curtain-like nets. And at the height of the fishery in the 1850s, 200 seines were working. One net alone reportedly taking 16.5 million fish, weighing 1,000 tonnes. It was a specialised and highly regulated fishery. Companies were allocated stems or lanes within which they were allocated to work, and a fixed time at stem before their turn was over. The local crowds that gathered were as partisan and knowledgeable as rival supporters at a derby match. The markings on the prows of the boats, which you can see here, and on the boats themselves, meant that the spectators could follow the fortunes of their favoured company amongst the literal network of seines across the bay and boats spinning about like a general regatta. It's very much like a sporting event as much as a working spectacle. The crews were directed by a hewer who signalled to the boats on shore the movement of the shoal. And while locals understood that complex choreography of the fishery, to the uninitiated visitor it was as incomprehensible perhaps as a play in American football. We see working practices being appropriated as part of a tourism spectacle. Artists were among the earliest visitors to the town. And you can see in these pictures how there was a sort of timelessness about the way they represented it. But the reality, of course, was that the fishery was still active, that men were still working on the seines. Whereas here you get the idle visitor contemplating the scene, for whom the capstan is quite literally a prop, and the boat reduced merely to a stage dressing for the visitor gaze. Now, the contestation of Porthminster Beach as a site of industry and a site of recreation is aptly represented in this image of the boat plot, already bisected by the railway viaduct and further encroached on by the building of the Porthminster Hotel, opened in 1894. Pascoe the boatman represents the immutable stereotype of the fisherman, valued by early visitors and pioneer bathers for their local knowledge of weather and sea conditions and tides. And this is taken from the photo album of the family of Sir Leslie Stephen, who spent their summers in St Ives between 1884 and 1896. As boats rot, bathing tents sprout. Pascoe the boatman would become the first proprietor of beach tents on Porthminster Beach. And the line of villas, which you can see at the top, these ones built by artists who were early colonisers who had chosen to settle in the town, began to expand along the cliff above the beach. In 1889, a visiting Methodist minister described coming across scores of boys swimming at Porthminster. Many, he said, with skins as brown as gypsies, telling surely of Iberian descent, disporting like amphibious creatures in the luxurious sea. It's a textbook moment of discovery, conflating social, racial and evolutionary primitivism with fear of the exoticised other. These lads would be exiled to the margins of the beach, as more up-country bathing practices led to the introduction of bathing regulations. Increased commercialisation of the beach led to competition and conflict between different proprietors. Pascoe's tents were swept aside by ordered ranks of bathing tents, far removed from the romanticised wild and peopled shore. Swimming as a recreation and sport in St Ives only began with the swimming matches in 1875, largely motivated by teetotal Methodist and other civic interests. Money prizes were an incentive to local boys and youths and to travelling professionals, and these events drew big crowds, but engaged with visitors only as spectators, not participants. Juxtaposing these two images, I can see a great similarity between the swimming matches on the left and the working practices of the seine fishery. It's as though the annual ritual of the matches filled a social and cultural void left by the decline of the fishery in the collective consciousness of the town. I like this image of boys paddling wooden wash tubs surrounded by spectator boats because it clearly has visual echoes of the working practices of the fishery. And I quite like the idea of the domestic intruding what was once solely a masculine domain of work. The last big catch of pilchards at Porthminster, and the only one for many years, was in 1907, actually the day after that year's swimming matches. By then, the last remnants of the fishery, the watching boats and crews just offshore, were already an anachronism, their meaning lost, subverted and appropriated to the general holiday scene constructed by the bather. By the end of the Edwardian era, the pilchards had disappeared, replaced instead by an annual influx of visitors. The fisherman had been driven from the beach and the bather had taken over. The site of traditional industry had become an uncontested site of recreation, but at least until the outbreak of the First World War, or the end of the slides, the annual swimming matches recreated some of the ritual excitement and the spectacle of the fishery. Thank you. That was an ad-lib at the end as well. Rescued it. Yeah.
A couple of questions.
Really fascinating, that sort of transition from industry to recreation. Was that reproduced elsewhere in the southwest?
It's certainly not being reproduced in any of the other places I'm studying. The sites of all the swimming matches elsewhere, other than in St Ives, developed in places where there was already an established bathing tradition. I mean, one of the interesting things about St Ives is that until the swimming matches happened, there was no tradition of bathing, no vernacular tradition of bathing whatsoever. And that was to do with an occupational resistance amongst the fishing community. The superstition that, you know, if you fell overboard or were pulled overboard by a net or something, then it's better to drown quickly than to prolong the agony of your death. There was also a bit of a Methodist thing in there as well, because if that happened to you, you know, they felt it would be subverting God's purpose if you were to, you know, swim to try and keep yourself afloat. So that there were reasons that, you know, one can, or explanations one can give for the fact that there was never this tradition of swimming at that time.
How did Methodism sit with giving prizes, money prizes?
The motivation for giving money prizes was to just encourage more kids to take part, more young people from the town to take part. I mean, it was a time of massive economic depression, not just in St Ives, in Cornwall generally, but what happened in St Ives is that you had the mining industry as well as the fishing industry, and they both took a hit at exactly the same time. In the mid-1860s, the pilchards disappeared, or began to disappear, began to dwindle in number. And the mining industry just collapsed. The global price of copper collapsed at the same time, and bank failures and various other factors. So, you know, there was a lot of very, you know, serious poverty and migration as well. I mean, a lot of people left Cornwall during that period. So the thing about giving money prizes was purely as an incentive. Elsewhere, in Exeter, for instance, they gave small amounts of money just as an incentive for taking part. You know, for younger kids, 10, 11, 12 years old, which, you know, later on backfires on them because it's then, you know, they're accused of professionalising youngsters.
Last one.
Your description of boys swimming in the sea, it
was like an Enid Blyton summer scene. Were any of those boys that were swimming in the sea, did they go on to be elite swimmers in the area?
The description that I read was from a visiting Methodist minister who came upon this group of 20-odd boys one day, naked, swimming off the rocks. And he created this, elaborate sort of primitivist fantasy around what they were doing. And actually, it's a much longer description than that, because he engages in conversation with these boys, and you can tell that they're actually, he's dressed, they're naked, and he's a Methodist minister, and they're winding him up. One of the boys says to him, "Oh, I've been in 20 times today, and I swim all day, and I come every day, and all this." And he's just lapping it all up, and it's I'm sure anthropologists have a term for it, but he's been very much misled by the natives, I think, on that one.
Well, a splendid start to the morning. Can we thank all